I don't know if it's just me, but when autumn comes around, I'm deeply attracted to revisiting media pertaining to wars of remembrance. In the first autumn of the pandemic, I kind of avoided my yearly annual ritual. It just kind of made me too sad and anxious. And despite all the problems still going on today, I have a deep hankering to go back to it. I kind of want to make up for last year. So, of course, I'm going to rewatch Band of Brothers and Saving Private Ryan, but something deep inside of me just wants to focus on the books. There is something maybe more personal from a book than a film, and there's a very special book I want to talk to you about today that maybe you've never heard of. I want to tell you about the movement it was a part of, about the man who wrote it, about why you probably haven't heard of it, and of course, to give you my reason why this book is better described as war horror than anything else. So, let's begin, and hopefully I'm in focus. Some of the most beloved works in literature, and particularly in the literary modernist movement, are great war novels. There are many renowned icons in this group. All Quiet on the Western Front, A Farewell to Arms, Goodbye to All That. These books were popular because they defied mainstream notions of duty and honor and respect to hierarchy. They were part of a larger artistic movement called the Modernist Movement. If you're unfamiliar, it's okay. Just think of it as a time where arts and cinema and theater and books transitioned from the broad and romantic to something a little more inward and cynical. Things got weird. A lot of people point to socioeconomic changes, globalization, and industrialization at the start of the 20th century as being the culprit as to why things got weird. While I disagree with each of these factors individually, all these factors joined together in a collective bombardment famously known as World War I or the Great War. Now, if you're like me where your war history knowledge is kind of beta, it's kind of easy to glance over the Great War in comparison to World War II, especially if you're in America. The latter, of course, is easy to wrap your head around. There were clear bad guys, there was a decisive victory, there was lots of action, as in moving around, and it left a juicy enough cliffhanger for a potential sequel. All we got was a shitty TV show adaptation. I don't know, Cold War kind of sucked, it's kind of boring. World War II was plainly bigger, louder, and a little more dramatic. Pardon the oversimplification. But that's sort of precisely why art shifted so rapidly after the Great War. There were no clear bad guys. There was not really a decisive victory. There wasn't a lot of mobility the public could trace on a map, especially on the Western Front. And after all was said and done, many people were either certain the unresolved bits would bubble up into another catastrophic war, or they blinded themselves to that reality. The Great War was a different experience than a lot of the participants have been told about what war was. There wasn't glorious charges, the battles weren't quick, and one didn't prove their mettle by using their might to defeat the enemy. They instead enjoyed a war of stalemate, where technology surpassed the abilities of man, and where death was scattered randomly and horrifically, and where leadership became less about being a leader and more about an accounting job. I'm sure you're all aware about the horrors soldiers in the Great War experienced. And of course, after such a clash of expectations, what art would they create? In a way, they were betrayed by their cultures. There wasn't glory or honor, just pain and betrayal. And that's what Great War literature is about. Enter Charles Yale Harrison. An American journalist working in Montreal at the outbreak of the war, Harrison was enlisted in the Canadian Armed Forces. He fought in the Battle of Amiens and was wounded. About 10 years later, seemingly among a trend of books recounting the Great War, Harrison published Generals Die in Bed, and he did so among such literary titans as Ernest Hemingway and Eric Remarque. And the book fared pretty damn well, actually. Some might call it a smashing success. At the time of publication, Generals held its weight against some of the books written by some of the all-time greats in the English literature. So why was it forgotten? Well, Harrison as a writer never found the same success. I guess his only real important works after Generals was a biography of a famous lawyer named Clarence Darrow, and an early example of a genre of books we now know as self-help. Of course, that's all I could really glean from the Wikipedia article, but that can't be the whole story. There are plenty of books written by one-note writers that are still beloved today, and like, bias alert, this book is pretty good, and I think a lot of people who read it kind of share that view, so that can't be it. My other wheeling and dealings in the matter reveal that this book has two other reasons why General's success had not stood the test of time. The first is based in boring, dumb nerd shit, and the second is based in propaganda book burning shit. So remember when I talked about earlier that these great war books were part of a big shift in culture? It was sort of a lie. It didn't go from this to this. There was a step in between. Realism. Ever hear of it? 3 guesses to what it means in the literary context. If you guessed boisterous, metaphorical, caricature, and based in impressions, you would be wrong, you fucking idiot. Just kidding. Realism. To be realistic, you must be realistic. Books in the genre were boring. You know, a lot of people like realist books. They're boring. If you're not like an avid reader, you can't really appreciate it. They're boring. They're boring. They're boring books. Like imagine a book written about your last 5 days alive. Right now is the end of the book, and then the start was 5 days ago, and it's just about every single thing that happened then. It's a lot of boring details, but do you know what's a feature in a lot of boring details? Truth. Or at least truthfulness. I guess realism was born out of the industrial wave of technology. You know, I think an easy comparison or like aid into understanding why realism was a thing in books was like, you could go from painting pictures of grand epic scenery and maybe include something that looks like a monster or something scary or eerie or just like totally unrealistic to photographs. You know, you're getting a very, very realistic impression versus something kind of imaginary and making use of the medium, right? So realism is kind of the same way. Writing was like that. It was like, look how awesome everything is. Adventure and wild, and the queen is super dope, and imperialism's super dope. Nothing could be wrong. Everyone's rich. Hell yeah, let's party. Let's go to war against Napoleon. This fucking rocks to like, man, I work in a factory. I want to die. And for some reason, Generals was evaluated by academics at the time as a realist work. But if you read it, there's not a lot of details in it. And if you believe a lot of military records, there's a teensy-weensy conflict on truthfulness in Generals Die in Bed. So by that measurement, Generals is a bad realist book, and thus not worth preserving, right? You know, in the context of realist novels, it's a loser, it's a dork, it's a nerd, and it should be fucking thrown out, right? And because of that, these beta academics said, fuck it, no need to worry about Harrison's stupid gutter trash. Coming off that teensy-weensy issue of truthfulness is the public outrage that the book elicited, especially from Canada, arguably where the book should be the most embraced. They're a little desperate for culture up there after all. I'll dance around the spoilers, but the book features a little bit of looting, a little bit of extrajudicial executions of surrendering enemies by the Canadian Armed Forces. And if you know anything about Canadians, they're pretty heckin' proud of their contribution to World War I. Like, it might be their only culture outside of hockey and maple syrup and poutine. They take World War I very, very seriously. But anyway, Harrison made some controversial statements about the Battle of Amiens, and a lot of vets didn't like it. And same with powerful figures in the Canadian military. And they thought the title Generals Die in Bed was a little too cynical, and so it led to a number of efforts to get it removed from bookstore shelves. So it seems that the decision to evaluate the book as a bad example of a realist work, in combination with the Canadian Veterans League trying to get rid of the book at all opportunities, is sort of what diminished the legacy of Generals Die in Bed. But let's be clear, this is not a realist book. It's obviously a modernist book. There is exaggeration. There are practically no details in the book. Each sentence is extremely concise, and it is comparable in its voice and objective to similar modernist novels. You know, you don't have to be a big English nerd to understand. You know, you could read one book that's clearly modernist and then read Generals and be like, this is like that. It's at the same time. The guy is a young dude, fought in World War I. World War I marked the Modernist movement. He's like them. But where it differs, aha! While the narrative is stripped down and the plot is aimless, this book deviates from mere Great War literature, but to that of horror. So, what is horror? Arguing genre is stupid, and I just won't do it. I think it's fair to say that anything horror Horror is a work where the primary intention is to horrify the audience. Yes, other great war literature features some of the gnarliest shit you've ever read. You'll be shocked and you will be horrified. However, I'm taking the position that almost every other great war novel uses horror as a tool to create contrast to other parts of the story. All Quiet will fuck you up, but it's primarily about demonstrating the culture loss of a generation. It's talking about society and relationships. Farewell to Arms is effectively a romance story, albeit an infuriating one that Hemingway would dare to do what he fucking did to us with that book. I might make a video on it soon. In these cases, war is there. It directly leads to conflict, and it guides a lot of the action, but it isn't entirely about the action. In the case of Generals Die in Bed, it is all about the war. Any deviation that occurs in the story is merely to demonstrate that war culture permeated all aspects of life as a soldier, or to bait the main character into a moment of relief as he endures a greater and greater intensity of psychological and physical torment. Now, I'm about to get into specifics. I'm not going to spoil the meat of the story. I will talk about the first few chapters and its contents. However, it is just to show you exactly the mechanisms Harrison employs to do what he does to make the book war horror. I'm sure Harrison never intended the book to be anything other than a reflection of his impression of his experiences. Broader themes do exist, particularly about power and powerful figures, but that always takes a backseat to what the main character endures. When I say war horror, I mean that from a frame of a modern reader, that this book is better described as a horror story than in any other way. The book opens in Montreal, where the new recruits based in their pre-war glory. We're told it is after payday and the smell of liquor and women hangs in the air between the bunks as the young recruits stay up past their curfew. The young drunk boys brag about stiffing hookers, vomiting that night's revelry, and singing about mutinous songs lamenting any form of military activity. Kind of interesting that this behavior is noted before they even experience war. Their sinfulness is stifled by a stuffy enlisted man named Anderson, a middle-aged preacher who doesn't seem to fit in with the crowd. Something, lost generation, something. Our narrator watches Anderson as the nuisance of sin grows in the bunks. There's one moment where he builds up the courage to face the debauchery, and a salvo of oaths greet him. Kind of a funny way to introduce the novel. This is perhaps the best we'll ever get for foreshadowing. A salvo of oaths. It's blunt, it's obvious, but it's succinct. And Anderson, for what he represents, duty, morality, responsibility, this is not, as we will see, conducive to life in the trenches. The next day, the boys are set to march, still drunk, through the streets of Montreal, to the train that will take them on their journey to the Western Front. Civilian celebration booms as the boys go on. All day long, the military police have been rounding up our men in saloons and brothels. We are heroes. The officers treat the drunks like ground meat, mashing them into place in some futile effort to cast a romantic image of soldiers going off to distant lands. Flowers and gifts, such as cigarettes, are scattered all over the soldiers as they march. As the marching column kind of disintegrates, as the crowd comes in, it's just kind of a booming party, like, we're gonna kick the Germans' ass, Canada #1, fuck yeah, we gonna win. Our narrator is met in the open arms and lips of a strange girl that I don't think he's ever known. She's just a stranger, and she just thinks like, wow, this soldier boy is hot AF. I totally want to hook up with him. So she kind of like walks with them. They're like, ooh, you're so hot. I wish I could stay. So she goes on with him to the train station, and he finds himself more and more in conflict of his departure. He doesn't know this girl, but what she represents is the life that he's leaving behind. Eventually he gets to the train and must bring himself to let her go, and the train remains at the station for hours. Like, hours and hours. The party dies, the crowd leaves, but the soldiers are left to stay. So that's chapter 1. Like 6 pages. The chapters are very like narrow. They're kind of like vignettes, kind of capturing kind of moments rather than a period of action, and we'll get that later. So immediately the next chapter is where they're thrown into the trenches. They have to march all night to get to their spot, and they're to relieve whoever's there now. We meet Fry and Brown and Cleary and Broadbent, other recruits like our narrator, and their English officer overlord Clark. Fry whimpers and struggles to march due to ill-fitting boots. Clark is vicious and offers no sympathy to the man. The recruits get to the front line at midnight, and those they relieve are quick to retreat to greener pastures. Already we see the pits of fetid water and the liberal application of razor wire, and a proximity to the enemy that forces the boys to speak in whispers. But our narrator notes the stillness of the night and recalls the Laurentian mountains as if comparing the trenches to a mountain vacation. Fry leads sentry duty and removes his boots. His heel is cut and his sock is soaked in blood. All he can think about is getting a new pair of boots. Our hero rotates to sentry duty. His mind fires through the boredom, recalling his training and imagining what combat would be like. A sergeant patrols through and reminds our hero that the enemy could attack at any moment now that it's dark. Our hero is now seeing movement everywhere he looks. He has to constantly reframe himself. And suddenly he adjusts and he sees it. There's actual movement in front of his face. He's horrified and he seizes up for a moment until he realizes that what's in front of him on the parapet of the trenches is a rat the size of a cat. It scurries off and he thinks to himself, I remember with a cold feeling that it was fat, and why. Sometime later, time is like whatever, at some point later, but physically 2 lines away from in the text at that moment, German Miniwürfe? It's an artillery called minis descend upon our hero. Is at this point we get our first sense of the horror aspect of the novel, and this is going to reoccur frequently. Our hero experiences his first bombardment and the helplessness it entails. Each blast is such a concussive force that everyone literally tries to bury themselves in the mud that they're in to try and escape it. Shrapnel rains everywhere. The smoke from the artillery pierces their lungs. There's no sign of help or hope, and even when it stops, it just is going to start up again. The soldiers rejoice whenever the artillery strike moves away from them, even if it's to the trenches just right beside them. They're just so happy that it's not them getting it. This is also our first taste of one of the primary themes of the book, and that is every man for himself. The bombardment finally ends, but their safety is not returned. We do not know what day it is. We have lost count. It makes no difference whether it is Sunday or Monday. It is merely another day, a day on which one may die. The shelling a few nights ago smashed our section of the trench. We build it up again, and the next night another shell demolishes it. We are now exposed to rifle fire on our left flank. There are snipers in the woods about a half a mile away. All day long we have to crawl on our bellies. Brownie straightened up for a moment when he was going to the latrine yesterday, and a sniper knocked his helmet off. He came into the dugout and related his experience to us. God, a man can't even pump ship without being shot at. Some war. Kind of a dark humor approach to reflecting your first kind of week at war. After that, we get another look at a horrifying aspect of the war, and perhaps the primary enemy, at least in Harrison's mind, and that's lice. He describes being plagued to no end, where most men are covered in gaping wounds from the relentless itching. When people are awake, they're like monkeys, constantly picking lice from their clothes and squishing them. The problem is when they're asleep and cannot control themselves, they'll itch until they're soaked in blood. Before I get into the last moment of action horror I'm going to describe to you, I want to read to you a passage related to the devastation of the earlier bombardment. On the way down to the latrine yesterday, I noticed that a shell had torn a hole into one of the sides of the communication trench. Some wire stuck out from the hole, some old cans of unopened bully beef, and the toe of a boot. It was an officer's boot made of soft brown leather. I tugged at it until it gave way a little, and then it came easily. It was filled with a decaying foot. The odor was sickening, and I dropped it in disgust. When I came back, Brown limped towards the latrine. He was gone quite a while, and when he returned, he had a pair of soft, brown, leather shoes tucked under his arm. I found them near the house, he said. They're dirty, but with a little cleaning they'll be all right. They're just the right size. I tried them on. He sat down beside me and took his shoe and sock off. Look at this, he said, showing me his foot. The back of his heel was raw as a lump of meat. After being out on rest, which turned out to be nothing more than repeated mindless drills, being constantly chastised and reprimanded by their officers, and living in utter squalor, our hero returns back to the line. A mortar destroys the end of their trench, leaving them open to sniper fire along the whole length of it. They have to wait until they're able to fix it, and they have to live on their bellies. But the rain is just pouring on them. They crawl and slither in the mud, living in constant fear. They reflect on their hatred of the German sniper who has found his target and is waiting ever so patiently for his opportunity to strike. Time to read again. Sooner or later, this German sniper, who keeps us cowering in cold fear, will be caught in advance by our troops. We will fall upon him and bayonet him like a hapless trench rat. He will crawl out of his hiding place as the first wave swarms about him menacingly. He will hold his trembling hands on high and stammer the international word for compassion and mercy. He will say that beautiful word, comrade, a word born in suffering and sorrow, and we will stab him down, shouting to one another, "Hey, look, we found a sniper," and our faces will harden, our inflamed eyes will become slits, and men will stab him futilely at his prostrate body. But now they bring him his extra rations. His rifle is fitted with telescopic sights so that we are brought quite close to him. Slowly he elevates his weapon, looks through the glass, and sees a target as though it is but a few feet away. Then he pulls the trigger and one of us drops out of sight. They think they can get away with sitting for a couple moments to relieve themselves from the mud, but the sniper's always there and he's ready to shoot it. They finally get some rations and it is Brown's turn to prepare the food. They have one spoon for the trench and it's kept up high for easy access for all, and it's wedged on the parapet side of the trench between some sandbags overhead. Brown stands to reach for it, for he must divide the sugar for their tea, and that's when the sniper gets him. Brown, in the dead men's shoes he had just found, falls and knocks over their tea and their sugar into the mud. Now they must live with his body while they try to recover what rations they can. And all Harrison can glean from this moment is that now they get to divide their food among 4 people instead of 5. Now, the rule for this war is get information and be brutal. You know a road is a crossroad, so you shell it with overhead shrapnel. You know where the front lines are, so that you gas it in the hopes that maybe your troops can go through without meeting resistance. You seek to know every little detail and then waste no opportunity to eliminate and wound at all costs. Soldiers know this callousness. Our hero, in the monotony of going on to the front lines and then coming off, sees exactly how this world works. Near the front lines is a coal factory where all the surrounding buildings are blown to bits. This icon of industry, and thus an icon of war industry, remains standing. It's odd that this coal factory is still around. It comes to our understanding that this coal factory is in fact owned by a German industrialist. Thus, the Germans won't target it. This is an element of the social horror the book has. This whole book goes into the immediate struggles and fears of life in the trenches, contrasted with the worldly pleasures the boys can attain. But all of that, anything good, gets stripped of all meaning when they come to the realization that every moment in fear of a sniper, every concussive wave that slashes through their bodies, and every life they ever had to take, all of it was merely a formality in the quest for fortune. Now I'm going to read to you another section of the book. This is probably the thesis of the novel. It is a dialogue between a bunch of men as they move in a truck aimlessly back and forth along the front as the British forces prepare for an offensive. This problem in mathematics is too much for us. If one 12-inch shell costs $5,000, then a major must cost, it is too much. I bet that dump going over there must have cost $1 billion. And I bet somebody is making a profit on those shells, whether they're fired at the Germans or whether they just blow up. Sure they do. A surprised voice from the corner says, "I just think all the people that's getting a big hunk of the swag out of it. Shoes, grub, uniforms, bully beef." He breaks off. We all join in enumerating the various materials of war on which someone may be making a profit. And big profits, too. The lorry hits the side of a shell hole and knocks the breath out of us for a while. We continue the conversation. Sure, and I'll bet that those people don't want the war to end in a hurry. Of course not. At Etaples, when I was going on my leave, I heard a madame in an estaminet say that she hoped the war never ended, with her getting 5 francs for a bottle of vinegar that she called vin blanc. Why should she? All of us wish the war was over, but believe me, there's plenty that don't. There's those that make the shells, the clothes, them that sell the food, rifles, socks, underwear, ships, boots. Others break in. Flags, airplane, artillery, officers with cushy jobs in Blighty, paymasters in Millbank, society dames playing the Florence Nightingale with wounded officers. These men who are making money on the war, they have wives and daughters and women, and there must be millions of them. And in every country too, in Germany and France and America, and they're all praying to God tonight for the war to last forever while we're riding in this goddamn lorry. And God must be listening to them. Look how long it's been going on. The thought of people benefiting from our misery throws us into a melancholy silence. Broadbent has abstained from joining the conversation. It is a little mutinous in tone, and as a sergeant he did not take part. After a while, he answers the last speaker. Maybe they're making money out of it, but they don't really want it to go on. They don't think of it the way we do. To them, I suppose it's just a war. But the mutinous grumbler will not be down. Yeah, that's it. To them, it's only a war, but we have to fight. From out of the corner of the lorry, a voice. We're strangers to each other since so many recruits have come up. We do not recognize each other's voices at all. This voice says, there are two kinds of people in this world. There's those that like wars and those that fight them, pal. There's a sudden downpour of rain. We are soaked to the skin. The lorry rumbles and bounces on. We are tossed about like quarters of beef on the way to market. We try to rest. So, let's talk about power. Our hero is never named. We can assume it's Harrison himself, but I think maybe he's not named to just kind of present a veil where any young man could read it and think of the experiences as his own. He lives a life of wanting luxury, wanting to enjoy worldly pleasures, and fear of bombardment. He's a very simple character in that sense, and I think it's by design. Now, our characters are utterly powerless. They don't have a choice in where they're going. In the section I was just referring to, I mentioned earlier, they're in a lorry for like 3 days straight, constantly being moved around, and as soon as they get to one place they have to go to another, and they don't have time for food. The ration trucks hasn't caught up and they have to move to a new place. I think he says they go like a day and a half without any food or water in a truck in the army as they're being prepared to make an offensive rush. So that kind of like dangling puppetry where these guys don't know what they're doing, and it's in this moment there's like hints of it where they realize who the puppet masters are. It's like the German coal factory, right? The people in charge aren't the military officers. It's not the kings and queens. It's not the prime ministers and presidents and chancellors and what have you. It's the people who can influence them, and it's the people who have money. Where and you know, the military industrial complex, we can talk about that a bit later. It's a well-known thing, and power is just a problem for Harrison, and it's a problem for all the characters in this book. I mean, we can talk about the title right now, Generals Die in Bed. It's about power, where the generals have a place to rest and grow weary and old, have families, have respect, honor, all these accommodations in their existence, that somehow their participation is worth more than others, while the soldiers sleep in mud. If they sleep at all, they are tearing themselves apart with lice. They are constantly trying to withdraw from the bombardment that surrounds them. The power differentiation is massive, and these boys are just so aware of it, but they're caught in a system where, like, literally if they try anything, they'll get executed, right? If they don't die on the front lines, their own people will kill them. So they are powerless to do anything, and they're cast into this hell. All right. So that section, we heard about all the different sources of money that are being gleaned, food, all supplies. These insights on the horrors of war, both the lifestyle and actions, and the hierarchical hopelessness, they're nothing new. Many who have undergone such trauma have relayed the senselessness of barbaricism and the ominous apathy of the military-industrial complex. Hell, when you're discussing Great War literature, it's a damn universal conclusion. But I'm making the argument that Generals Die in Bed does something a little different than other books. Other books really try and find humanity in relationships, whether it's All Quiet on the Western Front, where Eric Remarque provides vignettes of a slew of archetypes of boys, as if putting faces to names and telling society, like, look who you killed. Or Hemingway in A Farewell to Arms, where he's looking for any escape, and tragically he finds it through a meaningful love. But somehow this is better than fear and carnage and boredom and just the all-round anti-human qualities the Great War had. Harrison doesn't do any of that. If he gives you a name, it's really just to clarify a series of actions that will follow. Broadbent and Carl's brother are perhaps the most meaningful characters other than the hero, and I'm not going to ruin the Carl's brother part because it is one of the hardest hitting chapters of the book. Now, I spent a lot of time wondering why Harrison wrote like this. Perhaps it's because attaching names and memories were too painful while he was writing the book, or maybe he was really trying to settle on the individualistic nature of society, the every man for himself. But I couldn't land on that. I wasn't satisfied. Harrison's precise writing, his focus on action, his omission of details and names, altogether it means that nothing mattered. There was no victory. There was no defeat. There was no life, and there was no death. It was that he and every other boy out there, they were driftwood in an ocean during a monsoon. They were there to experience the absolute pinnacle of human wit, to maximize suffering, whether that was weapons or allied procedures of life and battle. There just wasn't an escape. And then when I started framing it like that, it all really felt like a Saw movie. Except maybe even worse than that. These people weren't being punished for anything in particular. It was just trial after trial after trial where terror and suffering and anguish was supreme. Anything good that happens in this book is just a contrast what's later to be lost. You could say it's a metaphor about the loss of innocence, but it's more profound than that. It's about that there was no escape. That when you aren't powerful, you are powerless. Identity doesn't mean anything when you're in the army. Why should it? It doesn't do the generals any good to know who you are. They will place you where they know you will die. They will lie to you so that you will kill. They will starve you when they can't make numbers on a page add up. They will do whatever is necessary so it appears that they're doing their job properly. I'm going to conclude my talk of this book by attempting to repackage the horror. I think I put you off by maybe framing this book as depressing. I just want to say in its defense, it's not drawn out. Right? It doesn't try and make you feel every moment. In fact, on the contrary, it's easy to gloss over parts and miss horrific acts. That's kind of like what makes this book really good, is that its rereadability is awesome in a dark way, because you like read it and you're like, oh, damn, I forgot that fucked up shit happened in this. Other Great War books do a good job of demonstrating how harrowing of an experience it was, but the economy of words in general is die in bed. Like, pound for pound, you're just getting the most insight of like what bad things can happen. It's not a long book. Here. It's teensy. It's not a long book. It's not hard to read. Harrison has no loyalty to anyone in the book, so the book feels relatively free of bias. I was reading about his life, like in the book, the parts of the looting and the executions and stuff like that, and it doesn't seem as much of an outreach. Like, unless the whole novel is very fictionalized in the same way, there might be some truth in it. And like, obviously the Canadian military just doesn't want to come off as bad guys. Like, for one thing, it's a war crime what he's accusing them of, and two, just part of Canadian culture is that like they did really, really well in World War I. Like, it's a distinguishing part of their history. And some say it's like when the country became a country of its own. So there's interest to deny what Harrison said. I'm not saying it's true. I really don't know. It just, if the other parts of the book are truthful, and they do feel truthful, then the parts about the bad stuff, they also feel truthful. We talked about the author, the controversy of the book's release, and perhaps why the book did not stay in the mainstream eye in Great War literature. I think framing it as war horror instead of Great War literature gives it the space it needs to exist. It's nothing new technically, it's not a realist work, it's clearly modernist. There's nothing challenging about it except its content and just really wrapping your head around about how bad and pointless the whole experience was. I think if you're like me and you associate the autumn with remembrance and you want to experience it in book form, but you're not confident in your reading abilities, or at least you don't want to commit to anything super big, Generals Die in Bed is your best bet. It's 150 pages, but at least my edition, the lining is like super wide, so it's not dense. Like, it's 150 pages, but like a short 150 pages. I'm not a fast reader, and I can only sit and read for like 30 minutes at a time, usually like only 30 minutes a day. And I crushed this bad boy in less than 5 days. No big words other than French names of places, and you don't have to know a whole lot about the Great War to understand it. Although a brief understanding of the 100 Days Offensive will kind of help you understand kind of the context he was in. Like, he was in some pretty important battles going on at the time. Harrison's perspective is interesting. An American caught in the imperialist system. Canada was still under British command at the time, after all. It is comparable to All Quiet on the Western Front and A Farewell to Arms. So if you do like those books, and you want something similar, Generals Die in Bed, big time. Big time. And yeah, I'll end this video as a recommendation. If you've read this book or feel inclined to read it, let me know in the comments. I'd love to talk about it. And if there's like things I got wrong or just things I missed and should have talked about more, let me know. This book is quite meaningful to me. I was sort of assigned it in university, and I was just kind of surprised how like it's not like cherished like the other Great War literature is, and I just like love talking about it. Or if you want to inflate my ego and tell me you like this video, that'd be pretty dope too. Anyway, toodaloo, this your boy, Punkeydoodles.